25th Hour Radio Show.
You're tuned in to the 25th Hour Radio Show. I'm your host, Rob Fairless, and on behalf of my co-host, Randy Ashby, we would like to welcome you to today's program. Today on the show, we have Kathleen Marden. Now, Kathleen is a UFO researcher. She's an author, and currently she's MUFON's Director of Alien Abduction Studies. She's appeared on numerous radio and television programs, and it's an honor for us to have her as our guest today. Kathleen, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Oh, thank you very much. So how's 2012 treated you so far? Been keeping you pretty busy?
Oh, it's been great. It's been a very, very busy year for me with lots of traveling, which I always enjoy.
Oh, yeah, I love traveling myself. Now, let's get right into this interview because we only got 30 minutes, and I'm very excited to have you on the program. So, up until like 1990, you worked in the field of education, and you started off as a teacher. Yeah, and you started off as a teacher, and eventually you were promoted to education services coordinator. But what happened in 1990 that made you leave your professional career behind?
Well, in 1990, I had 5 children at home, and they had become teenagers. I was working very hard. I was trying to finish up my master's degree in education. I had been a social worker to begin with, and then switched to education. And it was all too much, really, and I had to take time off. My husband was willing to support me in doing this, and I had always wanted to investigate and write about my aunt and uncle's 1961 close encounter with a UFO and alien abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. I wanted to know for myself whether or not it really occurred. I knew that they weren't lying. They were reputable people. But I wondered if perhaps there was some kind of a mistake. Maybe Betty had dreamed it and Barney had absorbed her dreams. So that's why I began my research and my investigation of their case.
So you're saying you kind of got into it being maybe a little bit skeptical. Like, when did you first start challenging, the conventional wisdom as far as us as a species not being alone in the universe? When did you first get,
I'm skeptical about every case that I study. I'm not someone that you might call a true believer. I've had a close observation of a UFO myself, but that doesn't mean that anyone who believes that they've had a sighting of an extraterrestrial craft or anyone who believes they've been abducted actually has been. So I always start from a skeptical point of view and follow the evidence wherever it might lead me.
When did you first hear about your aunt and uncle's abduction?
Well, I was 13 years old on September 20th, 1961, and my aunt and uncle had been on a short vacation to Niagara Falls and Montreal. They were returning through New Hampshire's White Mountains to their Portsmouth, New Hampshire home when they had the close encounter and lost time that they couldn't account for. Now, Betty called my mother the following day, September 20th, and I was seated in the room during that phone call. So I heard my mother speaking to Betty about that. Within a couple of days, my family and I drove the 20 miles to my aunt and uncle's home, and then I heard the story from Betty and also saw some of the physical evidence.
Now, could you kind of just give us a brief explanation of what happened that night?
Yes, absolutely. Well, they were driving through northern New Hampshire when Betty spotted a new light in the sky. And what was so perplexing was that it moved very rapidly upward and stopped to the left of the moon. And as she watched it, it grew larger and larger in the sky until finally she and my uncle stepped out of the car to take a look at it through binoculars. They'd been to Niagara Falls, so they had binoculars with them. And it continued to come in closer and closer. As it did, she was able to observe that it appeared to be spinning, and it was moving erratically in the sky, in a stair-step pattern sometimes bouncing back and forth, and it was completely silent. They got out of the car again, and the craft was at that point about 1,000 feet away from them. This was by an area called the Old Man of the Mountain, and then they could see the windows in the craft. Returned to the car, headed south through this area called Franconia Notch in New Hampshire's White Mountains, and as they exited Franconia Notch, there's an area known as Indian Head. About a mile south of there, the craft shifted ahead and stopped directly above the highway, descending to within a couple of 100 feet of them. They looked up and they could see this huge craft right overhead and a row of windows through which an intense blue-white light shone. My uncle stepped out of the car and looked up at the craft, and at that point it shifted location to an adjacent field just to his left, which would have been to the east, and he followed it into the field. It tipped toward him, and he could see figures, non-human figures, looking back at him. They were dressed in black, tight, shiny uniforms, and were very, very threatening, and really made him very, very frightened.
Oh.
All of them, except for one, moved from the window area to what appeared to be some kind of a control panel, and their arms went up, and something started to drop down out of the bottom of this craft. And at that point, he became terrified. He attempted to pull his binoculars down from his eyes to run back to the car, but something was telling him that he wasn't supposed to do that, just to stay there and to be calm. But, of course, he couldn't. And he finally broke away and ran back to the car, telling my aunt that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. The craft then shifted over the top of their car, and Betty rolled down the window to look up at it. She thought that she was going to see lights, but all she saw was blackness. There was sort of this black void, and then suddenly they heard a series of code-like beeping or buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the road. The UFO was no longer there, but they heard another series of these beeping or buzzing sounds that brought them back to full consciousness, where they started talking again. They remembered nothing from that 35-mile stretch of road, and they had lost 2 hours' time.
Wow. Now, Randy, I'm going to let you go ahead and take over this interview just for a second.
Well, I mean, what an experience to be thrust into. You know, you're coming back from vacation, and all of a sudden you're confronted with something like this. I guess what I would like to know, I mean, kind of shifting back to the aftermath that we talked about, your Aunt Betty actually called your mom, was telling her, how did your mom take this news? Do you remember? You know, I know you said
yes,
you were there.
I remember. My mom was concerned because Betty was concerned. The craft had been so close that Betty was afraid that they had been exposed to cosmic rays or radiation that might harm them. And so she was speaking to my mother about this, and my mother said that we had a neighbor who was a physicist, and she would call him and ask him what Betty should do. Now, of course, Betty didn't have a Geiger counter, and I'll never know why he told her to do this, but he said that if she had a compass, she should take the compass out to the car to see how the needle would react. Now, we know that when you place a compass up by the hood, up by the battery and the engine, the needle is going to spin. But Betty didn't start there. she started by the wheel on the back of the car, and she moved up toward the trunk. And that is when she noticed that there were about 15 very shiny concentric circles on the trunk of the car. They hadn't been there the day before. They were all the same size. And she placed the compass over the top of them, and the needle would spin and spin. Yet, when she moved it away to another part of the car, the needle dropped down. So, these spots had been magnetized. And that was always very perplexing. We knew then that something had happened to the trunk of that car. Betty also was wearing a dress that night. It was a fairly new dress. And when she arrived home, she noticed that there was a 2-inch zipper in the fabric at the top of her dress. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric itself, and the dress was torn from waist to hemline. The hem was torn down on one side. There was no prosaic explanation for how that had occurred. The tops of my uncle's best dress shoes were so badly scraped that he had to buy a new pair of shoes. Their watches had stopped and never worked again. There were all of these perplexing things that they had no rational, reasonable explanation for.
But
they were there.
Abduction. Other than actual abduction. I mean, it sounds like, it's just a perplexing case. Now, I was reading somewhere where, now, I don't know, I don't want to throw out misinformation. Did they have a pet with them? Did they have a dog with them when this happened?
Yes, Betty and Barney had a pet dachshund named Delcy with them that night. And Delcy responded to those sounds as well. They seemed to hurt her ears. She was up on the back seat of the car looking out, and Betty turned around, and she seemed to be having that problem. Also, when she arrived home, Betty noticed a new behavior pattern in Delcy. When she was sleeping, her little legs would run and she would yip and yelp, and she developed a fungus infection on her skin.
Oh. Now, didn't the Hills, they went under some hypnosis sessions with a Dr. Simon. Did the sessions show any similarities in their stories?
Betty and Barney didn't actually remember what had happened. They were always looking for a competent psychiatrist who would do hypnosis so that they could recover these lost memories. They were finally referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, and from January until the end of June in 1964, they underwent separate hypnosis sessions with him, and he imposed amnesia at the end of each session, so they couldn't even remember what they said. They definitely couldn't contaminate each other's information. Yet each came out with an identical story of alien abduction.
Now, wasn't there also a strange occurrence that happened, I don't know how long after the abduction, dealing with Betty's earrings?
Yes, there was. And this has always been very, very perplexing. It's one of those high strangeness things that are associated with alien abduction. She and Barney had gone to the White Mountains in New Hampshire to attempt to jog their memories about what happened during that missing time, and to locate specifically where they saw a fiery orb in the road, because they always remembered this fiery orb and a roadblock, but they weren't sure where that was. Well, when they returned home that night, they walked into their dining room, and there on the table was a pile of withered leaves. It hadn't been there in the morning. Their house was locked up, but there were leaves, and they went over, picked the leaves up, and in those leaves were the earrings that Betty was wearing on the night that they had that experience. Very perplexing.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, actually.
Yes, it is.
Now, Barney, actually, he died at a very young age. I think it was 46 years old, if I researched that correctly.
Yes,
and
that
they said that maybe the media attention and stress surrounding the case, had anything to do with that.
I believe that it probably did. Barney was a driven man. He was very active in the civil rights movement. He was a member of the NAACP Legal Redress. He was also on the regional board. He'd been appointed by the governor of the state of New Hampshire to serve on the state advisory committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. So he was politically active in the state. He was doing good things for the people of the state of New Hampshire. And then this happened. There was a violation of confidentiality. Their story was never supposed to be told. And there was a violation of confidentiality, and it was published in a Boston newspaper. The articles ran for 5 nights. That is when the story broke, and eventually the book, The Interrupted Journey, was written by John G. Fuller. That was published in 1966. And so between Barney's civil rights activities and the promotion of the book, speaking engagements, having to travel for all of this, it really was an extremely demanding schedule. Also, Barney's father had died from a stroke. There was a genetic predisposition, you might say, and that, I believe, contributed to his early death.
Well, after the story broke, how were they treated by the people that they knew? You know what I mean? Were they treated differently?
No, not by the people they knew. The people who knew them knew that they were credible, down-to-earth people, that they didn't have a previous interest in UFOs. They were the first ones abducted in the United States, as far as we knew. There had never been a report of alien abduction. You'd heard about contactees during the 50s, but this was totally different. So, yes, they would continue to be treated as credible individuals. Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. She worked in adoptions and actually received a promotion in her job. Barney continued at his job, and both did fine.
Now, you're saying you're the director of Alien Abduction Studies with MUFON, right? Can you explain
I'm the director of the Abduction Studies team for National MUFON and the director of Abduction Studies for the state of Florida. Yes.
Okay. For the last few minutes of this interview, I'd like to concentrate a little bit about what you do, if that's okay.
Sure.
What exactly does that involve, being that title?
Well, there are a number of different things, actually. When a person has a UFO sighting or what they think might have been an abduction, they contact National MUFON at MUFON.com, very easy to go to, and they file a formal report. That report sometimes will come to me as a supervisor, sort of a national supervisor on that. If people have questions, sort of a state director might not be terribly familiar with abduction phenomena and might have a question, so I'm sort of a consultant in that sort of thing because I have a great deal of knowledge in that particular area of study. Also, I've been working on improving the investigation process. So a team of MUFON members from the state of Florida and from different parts of the United States have come together with me to develop new forms so that the investigation process will go smoothly for people because it's alien abduction is a pretty complicated thing, and there isn't a lot of general knowledge about it or how to approach it. So I assist investigators with that sort of thing as well.
Randy?
Has there ever been I mean, this is kind of off subject of Barney and Betty, but, well, not really, though. Has there ever been a case that you've heard of where, you know, the abduction was trying to take place and the abductees escaped without being abducted? Has there ever been a scenario like that?
You know, it's interesting that you would mention that, because the Mutual UFO Network's journal this month has a case where an abduction seemed to be in process. It happened at night in a couple's home. They were in bed but awake. She looked up, and there at the foot of her bed was a gray entity, and she became frightened. Her husband was awake too. The entity saw her look up at him, and he then took off running. She heard his footsteps as he ran through the house. So apparently that abduction was foiled.
So, I mean, and I know this is hard to answer, but is there a way to prevent being abducted by aliens? I mean, are we on to something here as far as prevention?
Well, you know what? I think that in the very beginning, when they took people like Betty and Barney, they were taking individuals maybe one time, and if they had a certain, maybe a characteristic they were looking for, they would take them more than one time and periodically throughout their lifetime. And then they might take their biological children as well. I don't think that just any individual driving down the street as it is at risk for an alien abduction anymore.
So they're looking at specific criteria.
They seem to be following genetic lines, yes.
Kathleen, would you say in your research over the years that most so-called, aliens are regarded as a species, a kind species, a mean species, or, just strictly using our race as guinea pigs in experiments, or what are they doing it for?
Well, I think that they're doing it for a number of reasons. I don't think that they intend to harm us. If they wanted to do that, they could. There have been hundreds of reports of reproductive experiments of individuals who have observed fetuses in these like giant test tubes or cylinders that seem to be growing in them on board a craft. Some women are presented with what appear to be hybrid beings, infants and young children who seem to somehow be genetically altered human beings with some of the characteristics of the ETs. And also the ETs, I am told by many individuals, seem to be interested in maintaining the good health of those that they take and work with. So I think also the fact that they wipe out people's memories, at least partially, of what takes place on the craft is probably an attempt to protect humans from the trauma that comes from abduction. Unfortunately, humans tend to remember the beginning of the experience. Either they're driving down the street and they have a close encounter followed by missing time, or they are later at home and they become aware of an alien presence in their room and then remember being rapidly taken up toward a craft, and that's where the memory ends. Or maybe it ends when they find themselves lying on a table inside that craft. So not many people have full memories of the entire experience, although some do.
Well, Kathleen, our show's almost out of time, but I want to thank you once again for coming on the show, and I want to give you the opportunity to let people know where they can go to your social media, your websites. I know you got a couple books out. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell people about that, if you would.
Yes, my website is Kathleen-Marden, MARDEN.com. Both of my books captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and Science Was Wrong. These are books that I co-authored with Stanton T. Friedman, nuclear physicist. They're available through PayPal on my website. If you order a book, it will be autographed by both Stan and myself. And I'm busy working on a new book that will be released next year as well. There are some articles that you can read on a number of different alien abduction-related subjects. And also you can read about my lectures and conferences for 2013.
Well, Kathleen, we thank you for being on our program, and you're always welcome to come back. I hope you enjoyed your time here with us, me and Randy.
I did. It was a pleasure to be with you.
And thank you for showing up. And, Randy, you got something to say to Kathleen before we leave?
Thank you so much for your time. We know how busy of a person you are, and we appreciate you being on our show very, very much. And like Robert said, hopefully you can come back and see us again sometime.
Yes, I hope so.
And keep up the good work.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This has been the 25th Hour Radio Show. You can find us on Facebook at the 25th Hour Radio Show. Join us next Sunday at 4 p.m. Central Time when our guests will be Eastwood Fish and American Lion. Until then, I'm Rob Fairless, and for Randy Ashby. Randy, are you there?
Oh, yeah.
We're the 25th Hour Radio Show, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
The 25th Hour Radio Show.